It came with a pen. One signature, silent, calculated, ignited the most catastrophic collapse in modern American industry. And it wasn't China, it wasn't Russia, it was Canada. While the US was busy flexing tariffs and political muscle, Canada played the long game. One pen stroke triggered an economic chain reaction so precise it brought Ford, America's legacy automaker, to its knees. Factories went quiet, dealerships emptied, the middle class vanished beneath soaring prices. And yet almost no one saw it coming. So now you've got to ask yourself, how did Ford fall before Tesla? Why did the world suddenly pivot away from US manufacturing? And what did Canada do that Washington never expected? Ford's EV dreams die first. Ford's electric future wasn't just a product strategy, it was the company's lifeline. The electric F-150 Lightning was supposed to be a cornerstone of its comeback story. Billions of dollars had already been poured into EV development across North America, with flagship production plants in Dearborn, Michigan, and Oakville, Ontario. But every blueprint depended on one assumption: uninterrupted access to Canadian minerals. Canada shattered that assumption. Within a matter of days, Ford's EV program entered crisis mode. At the Rouge Electric Vehicle Center in Dearborn, management froze procurement on core battery components. Production lines idled. Engineers were pulled from development and reassigned to crisis logistics. Even minor part shortages, connectors, insulators, synthetic foams caused cascading delays. And in Oakville, where Ford had just invested over $1.8 billion to transform its SUV production into EV assembly, the silence was even more deafening. Trucks didn't arrive. Workers were told to stand down. The financial market responded ruthlessly. Ford's stock price fell by nearly 12% in the span of 6 trading days. Major institutional investors began issuing sell-side warnings, and questions poured in from shareholders. What's the backup plan? How long will this last? Why wasn't Ford better prepared? Jim Farley, the company's CEO, went on damage control. Internal meetings turned tense. Public statements sounded vague. And behind closed doors, Farley reportedly urged both the US and Canadian governments to find an immediate off-ramp before long-term brand damage set in. But the damage had already begun. Ford had no domestic alternative for these materials. China wasn't an option. South America was too far, and building a new US supply chain would take years. This wasn't a pivot, it was a collapse. As Ford's factories froze, the fallout spread to the front lines of America's auto economy. It happened at the border. The border becomes a weapon. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. There were no airstrikes or embargoes. Instead, Canada played the quietest card in the trade war, and it might have been the most devastating. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, border enforcement protocols shifted overnight. Customs inspections became longer. Every automotive shipment was flagged. Trucks hauling lithium or aluminum were pulled aside for additional checks. Timing became unpredictable. What used to take 6 hours now took 3 days. Ottawa never officially announced the change. That was the brilliance of it. Carney didn't need to declare war. He just let bureaucracy do the work. Regulators added minor documentation requirements. Shipping manifests were returned for clarification. Inspection teams randomly selected battery components for extra scrutiny. The slowdown wasn't illegal, and it wasn't even technically hostile. But it was lethal to an industry that depended on speed. Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis watched helplessly as supply chains buckled under micro delays. Entire factories had to adjust their schedules to account for border unpredictability. Parts were air freighted at exorbitant prices. Trucks lined up at crossings in Windsor, Niagara, and British Columbia, their drivers sleeping in cabs, while production lines in Detroit and Chicago sat still. Meanwhile, Carney ramped up a global PR campaign, painting Canada as a defender of fair trade and a victim of American aggression. European and Asian leaders nodded, and as support for Canada surged internationally, the United States found itself increasingly isolated. The battlefield had changed, and Carney was winning, not with threats, but with patience. And as the truck sat still, one truth became inescapable. This was no longer a dispute, it was a dismantling. The CEO melts down. At the peak of Ford's electric transition push, Jim Farley stood on stages across the country, pledging bold investments, sleek new models, and a return to manufacturing greatness. He told investors that Ford would outpace Tesla. He promised working-class families that jobs would flood back to Michigan, but none of that survived Canada's retaliation. When critical minerals stopped moving, so did Ford's production. And suddenly, Farley was no longer a visionary. He was a man surrounded by silence and stalled assembly lines. Internally, the mood at Ford's corporate headquarters turned from ambitious to apocalyptic. Board members who once applauded Farley's bold direction were now questioning his judgment. The decision to centralize battery supply chains through Canadian channels, once praised as efficient, now looked like strategic negligence. Executive meetings grew tense. Mid-level directors began circulating private memos about leadership contingency planning. In public, Farley tried to remain composed. He issued statements about temporary challenges and supply interruptions. But behind closed doors, the panic was real. Layoff announcements began to leak. Plants in Dearborn and Oakville faced shutdowns. Analysts began cutting their earnings projections. Ford's stock plunged by double digits in just over 2 weeks. One CNBC segment bluntly asked, "Is Jim Farley still the man for this job?" What made it worse was the timing. Ford had just invested billions into its EV infrastructure. Its next-generation platform was meant to launch within months. Now, those vehicles, designed, funded, and hyped, were gathering dust. Shareholder confidence was bleeding out, and Farley, once Ford's boldest voice, could not seem to stop the hemorrhage. And while he stumbled to explain what went wrong, the next wave of collapse had already begun, far beyond his reach. We sifted through corporate leaks, insider memos, and government trade data to piece this together. So if you value real research over recycled headlines, hit subscribe now. Supply chains crack beyond repair. It started with parts, a chip here, a wiring harness there. But soon the trickle became a flood. Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers that depended on Ford's regular orders were blindsided. With production paused and demand frozen, these small and mid-sized companies had no lifeline. One auto electronics plant in Ohio laid off 260 workers overnight. A tooling manufacturer in Indiana filed for bankruptcy within days of losing its Ford contract. These businesses didn't just lose clients, they lost their entire reason for operating. Worse still, contract workers, the backbone of Ford's just-in-time delivery model, were abandoned. Many had no benefits, no severance, and no backup plan. As plants sat idle, thousands of these laborers were told to wait for updates. Those updates never came. Walkouts followed. Entire warehouse crews in Illinois and Missouri refused to report in after weeks of silence from management. The collapse was no longer hypothetical. It was physical, audible. Meanwhile, Ford's procurement system, designed for speed, became its own worst enemy. Delays compounded delays. Shipments that were rerouted through alternate suppliers faced new logistical hurdles. The border backlog with Canada still wasn't cleared, and with labor unrest in Mexico brewing, even alternative sourcing strategies became volatile. Every missed delivery was a canceled vehicle. Every canceled vehicle was lost revenue, and every lost dollar widened the gap Ford needed to close just to survive the quarter. The EV dream had now turned into a spreadsheet nightmare, and the infrastructure Ford had spent decades perfecting was no longer reliable. And as the company struggled to keep the lights on, another fire was already starting, one that would burn straight through its political foundation. The MAGA revolt begins. Factory towns in America's heartland don't usually protest. They believe in work, loyalty, and the power of promises. That's what made the backlash so devastating. In Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the very swing states that once helped elevate Trump to the presidency, anger was building. It started with confusion. Then came layoffs. Then fury. Workers who had cheered when Trump promised to protect American manufacturing now found themselves unemployed. One viral video from Toledo showed a laid-off welder standing outside a shuttered plant holding a sign that read, "We believed you." His voice shook with emotion. "You said you'd bring jobs. Now I'm selling my truck to pay rent." Fox News town halls turned hostile. Local radio stations fielded non-stop calls from disillusioned voters. Republican mayors in small towns found themselves under siege, not from liberals, but from the very base that had once carried them to victory. In rural Kentucky, even church sermons began to reflect the mood shift. "We can't eat promises," one pastor said bluntly. "We need jobs." The discontent wasn't ideological. It was survival. Voters who had stayed loyal for years were now openly questioning everything. "Was America First just a slogan?" asked one worker during a televised panel. because it sure doesn't feel like it now. And it wasn't just about Ford, it was the entire idea of American strength that felt like it was crumbling. The auto industry had always been a symbol of resilience. Now it was a symbol of betrayal. And just as the protests reached a fever pitch, another deeper failure came to the surface, one that exposed the real backbone of the American workforce. America can't build without immigrants. While headlines focused on tariffs and trade, another slow-burn disaster was quietly strangling the U.S. economy. The immigration crackdown. As deportations rose and visa approvals plummeted, entire sectors began to collapse, not just in agriculture, but in manufacturing too. For so long, America's auto factories quietly relied on immigrant labor. From janitorial crews to line workers to low-level techs, these men and women made the system function. Many were undocumented, most were unacknowledged, but they were essential, and now they were gone. In cities like San Antonio, Memphis, and Bakersfield, Ford-affiliated parts suppliers reported record turnover. One plant in Alabama lost 50% of its workforce in under 30 days due to immigration and customs enforcement raids. Another in North Carolina shut down completely after its key shift leaders were deported. These weren't just statistics. These were human gears in the machine. And without them, the machine ground to a halt, even in agricultural hubs that supported Ford's logistics infrastructure, fuel, packaging, produce. There were signs of breakdown. Crops went unharvested, shipping delays stacked up, trucking routes lost reliability as rural fuel stops, and food services collapsed. The impact was cultural as well as economic. American-born workers were not stepping into these roles. Despite high unemployment, applications for trade apprenticeships and entry-level manufacturing roles remained historically low. The stigma around manual labor still prevailed. College was seen as the only path, even if it led nowhere. The irony was brutal. While politicians railed against illegal immigration, their policies were undermining the very industries they claimed to protect. And now, with Ford on the edge, the real question emerged. Could America still build anything without immigrants? And just over the horizon, a new crisis loomed, one that would bring global consequences and test every institution still standing. China takes America's place. As American automakers stumbled over tariffs and border delays, China moved in with surgical precision. Beijing didn't just react, it executed a strategy that had been years in the making. Within weeks of the Canada-US standoff, Chinese trade officials signed mineral agreements with Canadian mining firms, locking in access to nickel, lithium, and cobalt, resources Ford once counted on to fuel its electric revolution. But China wasn't done. It turned south, striking assembly plant deals with Mexico, exploiting loopholes in the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement to bring Chinese EVs into the American market tariff-free. Ford executives could only watch as their rivals bypassed every obstacle they were still struggling to solve. Chinese EV makers like BYD and NIO opened new facilities just miles from the US border. Their vehicles? Cheaper, faster to build, and loaded with the same critical minerals Ford could no longer afford. And with the US now viewed as economically erratic, Canadian and Mexican suppliers began favoring these new Chinese partners. Ford had no response. Their EV roadmap was built on assumptions that collapsed the moment Canada flipped the script. Beijing stepped into the vacuum not with rhetoric, but with deals, infrastructure, and unmatched discipline. And just like that, the global auto balance began to tilt. But China wasn't the only one repositioning. Europe quietly backs away. While Washington barked about trade and tariffs, Brussels pivoted. Ford, once a staple across European roads, was now being quietly removed from the equation. European governments and automakers began reworking supply chains, moving away from US brands entirely. It wasn't a boycott, it was strategic silence. In Paris and Berlin, policymakers deemed the US unreliable, both in trade and production. Ford Europe, once the company's pride outside the States, saw its showroom presence shrink rapidly. Delivery delays made things worse. German dealers began replacing Ford inventory with local EV alternatives or Korean imports. Customers weren't protesting, they simply moved on. Post-Brexit, Britain followed suit. New trade routes favored Japanese and Scandinavian tech. With the US stuck in a spiral of recall headlines and supply chain paralysis, Europe turned inward, investing in domestic battery production and reducing foreign dependency. For Ford, the implications were brutal. Years of brand trust evaporated. Market share lost. The continent that had once helped balance out sluggish American sales now saw Ford as a liability. The company's leadership didn't even have time to react because the next blow came from inside its own house. Asia builds its empire on U.S. soil. Hyundai and Toyota weren't foreign competitors. They were replacements. As Ford factories went dark across Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, their Asian rivals flipped the lights on. Toyota broke ground on a new battery plant in North Carolina. Hyundai doubled production capacity at its Georgia facility. And suddenly, American EV workers weren't rallying around Ford. They were applying to work for its competition. Here's the twist. These weren't just foreign brands making American cars. These were foreign brands becoming more American than Ford itself. Hyundai qualified for U.S. tax incentives. Toyota's hybrids sold out in suburbs where Ford once dominated. Even the branding began to shift. Consumers started asking whether these companies were actually more dependable, more transparent, and more invested in America than the company with Henry Ford's name on it. Government officials noticed too. Federal grants flowed toward Asian-owned plants because they delivered results. Meanwhile, Ford kept issuing press releases about future models and prototype promises, none of which could roll off assembly lines without minerals Canada no longer supplied. America's industrial heartbeat didn't stop, it just changed hands. And as the labor unions looked for who could actually keep their members employed, many turned toward companies they once saw as outsiders. But the next betrayal didn't come from abroad. Mexico turns on Detroit. Ford relied on Mexico for low-cost manufacturing, secure supply lines, and labor predictability. But as the U.S.-Canada trade war dragged on, Mexico read the room and redefined the rules. The country began courting Chinese and Korean EV makers, offering tax breaks, industrial zones, and expedited permits. Ford's suppliers, struggling with paused contracts and idle factories, saw an opportunity. Many signed new agreements with Chinese firms looking to expand fast. Mexico's government, watching the power shift, encouraged the transition. In just a few months, Ford's competitive advantage in labor evaporated. Then came the headlines. BYD opens flagship plant in northern Mexico. Kia expands EV facility just miles from Texas border. Ford wasn't just losing market share, it was being replaced in its own backyard. Mexico had once been Detroit's quiet partner. Now it was betting on the next empire, and in Detroit, the silence said it all. Canada's energy leverage triggers panic. The final blow didn't come from a factory shutdown or a tariff hike. It came from the quiet hum of energy lines and the unmistakable silence that followed. Canada didn't have to cut the flow of oil or hydroelectric power. It simply had to hint that it could, and that was enough to set Washington, Wall Street, and Detroit on fire. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood at a podium in Vancouver and said only a few words. Canada, he explained, was reassessing its energy export priorities in light of global instability. He didn't say the words United States or Ford, but he didn't have to. The implication was nuclear. Within 24 hours, oil markets surged. Natural gas futures spiked. Spot prices on electricity in border states like Michigan, New York, and Minnesota doubled. But the damage didn't stop there. Ford's supply chain, already throttled by raw material shortages and border slowdowns, now faced a deeper crisis: logistics failure. Trucks stopped moving. Assembly lines went dark, not just from missing parts, but from skyrocketing transportation costs. It was no longer profitable to ship materials from Canadian plants to American factories. Ford's energy contracts, negotiated under the assumption of cross-border reliability, collapsed under the weight of panic pricing. The ripple effect moved fast. Rail operators delayed routes. Port facilities couldn't meet new insurance requirements. And worst of all, Ford's own transportation fleet, the backbone of its just-in-time delivery model, was grounded by diesel price shocks. One executive, speaking off the record, called it the end of the modern auto model. This wasn't just a supply issue anymore. It was a systemic freeze. And the freeze wasn't hitting just factories. It was hitting families. The middle class collapses. The Ford F-150 wasn't just a truck, it was a birthright, a symbol of American middle-class stability. A vehicle bought by teachers, welders, farmers, and union workers from coast to coast. But by the time the border bottlenecks and mineral tariffs were done, even the used models had drifted out of reach. The numbers were brutal. The average price of a new pickup climbed past $70,000. The used market didn't fare better. with 2-year-old models commanding prices once reserved for luxury sedans. Dealerships couldn't offer discounts, banks couldn't offer favorable financing, and blue-collar families couldn't justify the math. At the same time, job security disappeared. Ford's layoffs, once limited to production facilities, crept into engineering, design, and administration. Contractors were dropped. Bonuses were canceled. Small businesses that relied on Ford's supply and service contracts evaporated overnight. In places like Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana, the fallout was immediate. Foreclosures rose. Gas station lines shrank, not because fuel was cheap, but because families couldn't afford to fill up. Inflation, already a political pressure point, now had a face: the empty garage. It became impossible to separate the cost of living from the cost of mobility. If you couldn't drive, you couldn't work. If you couldn't work, you couldn't pay. And if you couldn't pay, your place in the American dream evaporated. Just like Ford stock. In a single quarter, Ford lost over 20% of its market value. But what Wall Street measured in billions, real families felt in unpaid bills and broken promises. And inside Ford's glass towers, the knives were out. Jim Farley is forced to resign. When the dust settled, the blame had one name. Behind closed doors, the decision had already been made. Jim Farley, once hailed as the visionary CEO who would drag Ford into the electric future, was now the face of its collapse. The boardroom was cold, shareholders were livid, and executives were whispering that the EV pivot, the trade missteps, and the political alignment with risky tariffs had come from the very top. The resignation wasn't announced with fanfare. No press conference, no celebratory departure. Just a short, carefully worded statement released at 2 a.m. on a Thursday. Mr. Farley has chosen to step down to allow new leadership to guide Ford through this next chapter. But make no mistake, he was pushed. In the weeks that followed, a new interim CEO was installed, one with a background not in design or engineering, but crisis management. Ford launched a media blitz to regain control of the narrative. Resilient manufacturing, post-tariff innovation, energy diversification. But none of it stuck. The public didn't buy it, the dealers didn't buy it, and more importantly, the workers didn't buy it. Trust had been shattered, not by one mistake, but by the perception that leadership had gambled with the future of American industry and lost. One viral video of a laid-off factory worker summed it up. "We didn't just lose a job, we lost the company we built." And just as the dust began to settle, the global stage shifted once again, without America on it. America loses its auto crown. It wasn't just Ford, it was the entire myth of American manufacturing. There was no ceremony, no declaration, no international headline screaming, "The empire has fallen." But one by one, the signs became impossible to ignore. Japan and South Korea secured new trade deals with Canada and Mexico, replacing American parts in the North American supply chain. European automakers shifted battery contracts away from the United States to avoid tariff exposure. Chinese manufacturers bought up distressed supplier networks in Detroit, Indiana, and Arkansas at cents on the dollar. And Ford, it became a footnote, a once proud symbol of industrial might, now flailing in a global marketplace that no longer waited for American leadership. Its factories were operational, but not dominant. Its designs were cutting edge, but no longer defining the future. Its trucks still moved, but only for those who could afford a price tag that once would have been unthinkable. The Ford of the 21st century hadn't just lost market share, it had lost the narrative. For over 100 years, the story of the American economy was told through its cars. The assembly line, the Mustang, the F-150. But in the span of just 18 months, that story was rewritten by policy failures, global realignments, and the quiet strategic patience of a neighbor once dismissed as too polite to fight. Canada didn't just win a trade war. It helped end the illusion that America could lead by default. The new world order of the auto industry is built on strategy, sustainability, and smart alliances, not slogans. And in this new world, the stars and stripes are no longer leading the convoy. This wasn't just a recall, it was a warning. For every company chasing speed over safety, ego over planning, and power over partnership. Ford didn't just lose a trade war, it lost control of its future. But here's the real question. If America's biggest automaker can collapse overnight, who's next? Drop your thoughts below. And if this shook your view of the industry, subscribe for more unfiltered breakdowns coming soon.